Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Format-approved learning lunch. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I'll be your host for today's session, which is called Successfully Navigating the Healthcare Cloud Minefield. I think this is a very exciting subject. I think the cloud is very important in healthcare and only becoming more so. And we have a great expert with us today to help us understand this subject. David OKeefe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Brian.
You can see a little bit about David's background here on the slide, but probably the major takeaway is that he has a lot of experience in IT and health IT in particular, and he is Netgain's VP of Technology. So he will be a very well-informed expert to help us on our journey today. Now here are the questions we're going to cover. We're going to have a conversation that's going to range across a number of subjects concerning the cloud. But while you look at these questions to get the lay of the land, I'll just address a couple of housekeeping items that always come up. The first is people always ask us if they can get a copy of the slides and a recording of the session. And so we just want to assure you that you don't need to worry about that. We will send a follow-up email after the session. And this goes even to those folks who weren't able to attend live. It will include a recording and a copy of the slides for you, so you can share those with other folks or refer to them again if you like. The other question we always get is, can I ask the presenter questions? And of course, we welcome all of those questions. Type those into the chat area. We tend to save those until the end of the session so we don't break up the flow too much. And then we will address those at the end of the session as time allows. If we run out of time, our expert will be happy to provide written answers for you. We'll be sure to get all of your questions answered. Okay, so that gets us through the housekeeping. Let's get to the fun stuff. First of all, David, thank you again for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's look at our first question then. So what are the common cloud adoption frameworks? What are we talking about when we talk about the cloud?
Yeah, everybody has a notion of what cloud means. You've seen what you see on TV commercials. You see what you read in articles, what others are talking about with your coworkers, your boss. And it helps if we start with a common definition of what cloud means, because then we can use that definition all throughout the presentation, so we're all talking about the same thing. A really great place to pull a definition of cloud is from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And there are a couple of elements that they use to define cloud. The first thing that they do is they say that it should be subscription-based. It's something that you have a monthly recurring revenue cycle that's associated with it. You are going out and saying, hey, I'm consuming Netflix. I'm paying for it on a monthly basis, and what I have access to is a content library that contains movies, TV shows. It should be something that is incremental. That means that it should be scalable, it should be elastic, and it should be based on the demands that you have. It's something that can grow with your changing needs. It's something that you can consume just what you actually need. Another core tenet is that it's delivered. Another core tenet is that it's delivered over the internet or a broadband network, something that doesn't have any type of geographic constraint. So whether you are in an airline accessing Netflix, or you're from a hotel room accessing Netflix, or you're from sitting on your couch, you're using a network connection to access that content. And then the final thing to say is that it should be pooled, something that you can have economies of scale associated with. You really want to make sure that as you have this service that can be available to many individuals, that you're doing so in an affordable fashion. And these are all of the elements that come together to create what we know as cloud.
Well, that is a very great definition and comprehensive, I have to say, because it seems to cover all of the major elements of it. But that's great information. Let's move on to our second question. So what makes cloud different then from other modern IT solutions?
Yeah, a really great way to start this question is to start talking about the utility industry, actually, because it has a lot of great parallels um, to the compute industry, to cloud. So back in the day when you wanted to have electricity for your home or for your business, you had a requirement that you need to go out and purchase all of that equipment, maintain all of that equipment for the generation of electricity. What we realized is that wasn't very efficient, that was very expensive for business, and we realized that it made sense to do more of a centralization model. So the book, The Big Switch by Nicholas Carr, walks through this transition of utility. And that transition really looked like having large-scale wholesale providers be the ones that focus on the generation of that electricity. What they do then is they partner with local co-ops, local or regional distribution vehicles for getting that electricity out to your home. In a lot of ways, that mirrors exactly what we're talking about with cloud. You're talking about the fact that um, cloud really refers to the centralization model, this ability to access it anywhere, the subscription base, all the items that we covered in that last slide. And so where you have a major difference is in that traditional modern IT solution, you may have all of those same components and same building blocks, but you're not doing it with maybe some of that same scale. You maybe not doing it in that same mechanism where you have cloud that you're working through a vendor to obtain that meets the business outcomes that you are desiring. And I think the thing to say is that cloud really amplifies certain outcomes inside technology. A modern IT solution is focusing on availability, reliability, efficiency, scale, predictability, innovation. All these things are really important to modern IT, but where a cloud solution is different is it amplifies a certain number of those. It amplifies specifically availability, reliability, economy, scale, ease of use. Those are the things that make that different. And again, when you come back to that model where you're thinking about electricity, you don't often think about, will this device work when I plug it in? So you have that reliability, you have that availability. As you plug in more devices in the house, you can continue to consume more electricity and you don't think, again, it gets back to that definition that it's elastic. So a lot of similarities with really a focus on cloud amplifying those outcomes.
Right, and you don't have to worry about having, some new kind of electricity if you have a new device, whether it's a lamp or a tablet, you can just plug it in and it will work. Um, the thing that really made me laugh when you were talking about utilities is, not from this book, but another book, Devil in the White City. He talks about Chicago in the 1890s where they were generating electricity the way that you talked about, and the whole city was just covered in a haze of coal smoke. So I'm glad at least that our computers don't require coal to keep working, but there are definitely some similarities there. So one of the things I think confuses people is that there's so many different kinds of cloud solutions out there. Can you talk about that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question, why are there so many cloud solutions, is because it's become the predominant model. Cloud has been available for quite a long time, and it's really the last 10 or 15 or probably 5 or 10 years that the focus on cloud and cloud as a solution has really become prevalent. But cloud as a model, like I said, focuses on the outcomes that we talked about of security, availability, reliability. These are things that businesses are really looking for in an IT solution, because they're not looking for IT to be just a cost center, but they're looking for IT to be a strategic asset. As the cloud industry has matured, there have also been a number of varieties of cloud. You've heard about just obtaining infrastructure. How can I run just a virtual server? Then you move up and you say, well, I need a database for my electronic health record. How can I consume just a database? Or you say, hey, I'm looking for email. How can I consume email without having to have my own email server? So there are a bunch of different ways that you can incorporate that. And then you generally hear of all of these offerings as a service. So you hear security as a service, or storage as a service, or backup as a service. The thing to be careful about, though, is some vendors have come forward and they have attempted to rebrand old products or services by associating the buzzword cloud. And this is where we start to talk about the term cloud washing. I want to give a really good example of this. A couple of years ago, I remember seeing a TV commercial for a hard drive. It was just meant as a hard drive for you to back up your pictures, back up your movies, back up your documents at home. And it was referred to as a cloud personal storage device. Bring the cloud home, access it anywhere was the tagline. And they specifically said, with my cloud, it's no longer a mystery of where your personal files are stored. It's your own cloud that you control, and you'll always know where your videos, music, and documents are in a safe place, your place.
So the
Now,
irony
the
here is
challenge,
it's sort of the opposite of the cloud.
it really is. I mean, when we go back to that notion of economy of scale, we don't have any of that, or subscription, there's no notion of that, or scalability or elasticity of resources. You don't have any of those things, but when people just associate cloud with only one attribute, like I can access it from anywhere, that's where you have this term cloud washing, and that's where you can have so many solutions that seem like they might be a cloud solution.
Very interesting. I had not heard that that was going on, but it makes great sense that it is. So you've talked in a general way about how the cloud offers these advantages, but what are the real kind of real world benefits?
Yeah, the real world benefits are really a focus on the IDs. And when I say IDs, I mean it's a focus on availability, security, reliability, predictability, scalability. All of these things are the primary driver for cloud. Inside that cloud model, though, there are a couple of things that are specifically worth calling out. When we talk about resiliency, for example, many or most cloud solutions are designed with a concept of high availability. Again, getting back to that concept of plugging in a lamp and always expecting it to turn on, cloud solutions really focus on how I can make sure that it's resilient from failure and that it's always available. When you move to a cloud solution, one of the things that happens is you move your assets to another provider, and that offers some risk management. You're outsourcing some liability, some of your business associate liability, and you're sharing the burden of compliance. So now maybe instead of having physical servers that are in a data closet in my office, I don't have to worry about that physical security because that's something that I'm outsourcing to a service provider. We also talk about staffing. One of the challenges that we hear, especially in smaller practices, is the difficulty in finding and retaining talent. All of the electronic health record applications focus on a database of patient information. Well, database administrators are critical, but they're really hard to find. That's a scarce resource. You also tend to have individuals that have maybe an inch of knowledge across a wide variety of topics, but you don't have anybody that can do that really deep knowledge. When you have that service provider organization or that cloud organization that you're working with, they have to have that deep level of expertise across all of those domains. And then there's also a notion that that isn't strategic to your business. Focusing on doing patching of Windows servers isn't strategic when you're focused on patient care. Again, we've talked a lot about scalability and flexibility. Some ways to hit home when you have a software upgrade or a patch for the electronic health record, and suddenly the electronic health record is consuming a lot more resources. and you need to have that scalability to give it more horsepower so it can be performant for the providers. Or what happens when you have meaningful use requirements that make it so you have more reporting needs, that you suddenly need to deploy more resources, scale up resources. And then in all of it, you have economies of scale. You have a provider that is purchasing large quantities of server or storage or network resource to put together this solution, and the buying power of that organization is so much stronger that they can leverage those relationships to really focus on bringing down the cost, but still providing you with that enterprise level technology. And then it's also worth noting, too, that it can change your cost structure from a capital expenditure model to an operating expenditure model. So instead of having, every couple of years where you have a large amount of money that you're spending on hardware, you can even out that expense in an operational model. You can take things like software licensing, for example, Microsoft Office or other Microsoft applications that you're using, and you can amortize those out across all of the months. So all of these things come together, and they really focus on the benefits that you have. Maintenance, speed of deployment, staffing challenges, all of these things make cloud a really attractive solution.
Absolutely, and that was a great description of the reasons why generally when I've talked with providers, encouraged exploration of cloud options. The staffing challenges issue is such a key one, that it makes no sense for most small practices to have a dedicated staff member. So they hire an IT company maybe, but in most cases they're going to have a much better fit with the cloud for the reasons that you talked about, simply because you've got that depth of expertise available to you as part of the economy of scale. So I just think there's so much about this that makes sense. The other thing you didn't focus on a lot, but I think this is a big one for a lot of healthcare folks, is backup and disaster recovery. Folks, they have to do that for HIPAA. Not everyone does it. But talk about an example where the old model of sort of writing to tape and then taking that somewhere, compare that with the cloud solution to this. The cloud solution is just so much more secure and so much easier for the provider that you just have to be crazy to do it the old way, in my opinion. But there's so many advantages to this approach.
Yeah, I completely agree. Backup and disaster recovery is a really great one to talk about. And actually, as we move into the next slide, we'll talk about the ways that healthcare organizations are actually starting to use the cloud. Because it's important to realize that people are starting to use the cloud in very meaningful ways. When cloud first became a prevalent topic, people were really just starting to figure out, how do we want to use cloud? What does cloud mean? And they took a very slow and cautious approach. And their focus was, maybe I can host my website, or maybe I can consume my email service from the cloud. It was all things that were either low-risk services or more commodity-based services. But now, with the maturity of cloud, the recognition of the benefits of cloud, we see healthcare organizations really meaningfully consuming cloud services. So HIMSS Analytics has done studies, and this is one of those studies that shows how healthcare organizations are using cloud. And the top way that they're using cloud is for hosting of clinical applications and data. That's a really big deal. That means they are taking their electronic health record, they are moving that into the cloud, and they are consuming that as a cloud service. Another really common one is health information exchange. You have a requirement to be able to share information with other clinical or healthcare organizations. You may have a need to work with a third party to obtain lab results, for example, for your patients. Brian, you hit on this exactly, backup and disaster recovery. This is something that HIPAA and high tech talk a lot about, that clinical organizations and healthcare organizations need to focus on how they can make that patient data be available. And it's a difficult thing to do. But the point here is that there are a lot of ways that healthcare organizations are meaningfully using the cloud. The cloud is definitely ready for these, and we have planned adoption that's only going to continue to grow and accelerate this data.
I'm fascinated by the high percentage of HR applications and data. I'm not as familiar with that world, but I'm surprised that that number is so high. That's an area, for example, that I just wouldn't have thought about being in the cloud.
Yeah, it's a great solution for a software as a service type solution where you go out to a web page, you log in, maybe here's my payroll data that I'm entering, here's maybe my time cards that I'm entering. It's a really easy thing to not have to have on premises. And when you think about it, things like payroll systems were outsourced to companies like ADP many, many years ago because it's not something, again, that's strategic to the business. It's just a service that the business needs to provide, but they don't want to focus on it.
Makes perfect sense. So what are the top concerns then? We've been talking about the good things about the cloud. What are concerns that may hold people back?
Yeah, when people look at cloud, they don't necessarily know what cloud means. And where you don't know what cloud means, there's a certain amount of fear and uncertainty and doubt that it's the right thing. You have certainly the momentum that says everyone is moving to the cloud, and that's what gets people to consider it. But what are the things that they're concerned about? They're concerned about security. How am I making certain that my patient data is staying safe? They're concerned with performance. How am I confident that my providers aren't going to scream that the EHR is running so slowly that it reduces the number of patients they can see per day? And then there are concerns about integration with legacy systems. There was a client recently that had a RIS 6000. They were an early adopter for EHR. It was a green screen EHR application originally, and they've just progressively moved that forward over the years. And they have questions about how do we integrate that type of solution to a modern solution from a cloud provider. So these things come together to really have people wonder, is it going to be as safe and secure? Is it going to be as performant? How am I going to access it? Is my telecom going to be reliable enough that I'm not going to go down? So is it resilient? And those are things that are really on people's mind as they look at moving that data outside their four walls to a cloud solution.
Yeah, in many ways it sounds to me like it's kind of an issue of trust almost, or at least of not being directly in control in the way that they may have been in the past, and so it causes a lot of anxiety about what the potential downsides could be.
Trust is a really important word when you talk about cloud solutions. Every time you have a major cloud provider that has some type of a challenge with security or availability, it generally gives all cloud providers a little bit of a black eye. And so much of what you're focusing on in a cloud solution is building and establishing that trust with an organization that you are going to be a good steward of that data. You're going to make it available. You're going to protect it. You're going to do all of the things that that healthcare organization would do with their own data if they had the resources to do it.
Well, that makes sense. When it comes to healthcare cloud minefields, though, what are some of the issues that people need to watch out for?
Yeah, one of the biggest ones that people are really concerned about and need to watch out for is performance. What does it look like to authenticate to the solution? What does it look like as I pull up a work list? How long does it take to transition from one patient to another patient? How am I going to see any delays with any interfaces as I need to move data from a PM to an EHR or from a lab system to a EHR? Performance is something that providers think about very regularly, because they are focusing on treating as many patients in a day as possible. So it's really important to focus on performance and to ask questions about how the solution will perform, to experience that solution, to make sure that it meets the needs of that healthcare organization. Security is a really big one. We talked that one of the benefits of cloud is that it can help take that risk, and it can help share that risk across multiple organizations, but that can be challenging and something to watch out for as well. Back in 2013, there was the omnibus ruling as part of high tech that introduced the concept of subcontractor business associate agreements. And what it was a focus on chain of accountability. How can I make sure that this business associate that a covered entity is working with is protecting that data? How can I make sure that my business associates have their subcontractors protecting that data? So it's important to ask questions about business associate agreements and the layering of those business associate agreements. Important also in that context of security is we've said that the solution is now highly available. So in many cases, solutions can be accessed from a phone, from a personal computer, from an internet cafe. And as you have that data now available in more locations, you really have the concern of how do I make sure that I'm protecting that data? How do I make sure that I'm centralizing that data so I can have safe harbor from breach notification if any type of device is lost or stolen or compromised? As you look at availability, one of the biggest concerns is your practice relies on their health record system. So how can I make sure that I'm always going to have access to that? What tools do I put in place to ensure that if an internet connection goes down, that I still have a way of accessing that or treating patients? Also in availability, you have concerns over the change management of the spectrum of vendors. So it's one thing for your own organization to talk about the changes that they're making to IT. It's another as you're starting to coordinate with an EHR vendor. You may be coordinating with a service provider. You may have maintenance schedules that you're working with as part of a big cloud provider. What does it look like to transition to a cloud solution? What is the cost and complexity of switching? How do I get legacy data into that system, or even should I bring legacy data? What if I find out that the cloud solution isn't right, or there's some challenge that just doesn't meet my business need? What does it look like to exit that contract? How do I get access to data? How much data do I have? What challenges are associated there? When you talk about silos, you have things like application interdependence. So what if I have a certain amount of my data that I'm moving to a cloud solution and a certain amount of data that I want to keep locally? How do I make sure that I understand what products and services are talking together so I can keep those together? What happens when I want to consume Microsoft Office as a cloud solution? Does my electronic health record need a copy of Microsoft Office locally to generate reports or to modify charts or patient documents or templates? So understanding how data moves in the organization, understanding what reliance one piece of software has on another is a really important thing. And then in all of that, making sure that there's an understanding of how licensing is being handled. You may be licensing local workstations, but now in a cloud solution, is it your obligation to provide that licensing? Is the cloud provider providing that licensing? And then pricing. Pricing is a really big one. People are looking to make sure that they can be as effective with their dollars as possible, but there are a number of ways that you can consume cloud services. You can have consumption-based or provisioned-based. So how much of this cloud service did I consume? An example of that is, how much backup did I have for my systems? In a consumption-based system, you pay for exactly what you use, but you run the risk that there can be some type of a process that consumes a lot more than you've expected it to consume. In a provisioned model, you have really here's the capacity that I have available to me, and you don't have to worry about some of those spikes of what you're consuming, but you're a little further away from that utility model of I'm paying for potentially more than I'm actually needing to consume. So it's really a question of how does the price grow as you grow?
That's a great point. We don't usually think of it this way, but there's different kinds of subscription services. You could look at the utilities as being one that's consumption-based, as you said, but then, of course, something like Netflix is purely provisioned. So that's an important distinction. I wanted to hop back just for a second to security because your points there, I wanted to just reiterate the fact that you do, in that security concern, have the advantage of the cloud in the sense that you're going to have, if you're working with a reputable cloud provider, you're going to have security staff with that cloud provider who have a level of expertise that is likely to be far beyond anything that you would need or have any reason to have at, say, a small practice. Could you just expound on that for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. When you are a service provider or a cloud vendor, you start to talk about how I can have multiple clients working together. And as soon as you start talking about multiple clients and you start talking about that framework for how to protect that data, it becomes very important very quickly to have that security expertise on staff. The individuals who are focusing on the changes in laws and regulations, that are focusing on making sure that that hosting provider is compliant. And as a smaller practice or even a mid-sized practice, you have a budget for IT, but it can be really challenging to have a budget for somebody that's security focused. And the notion there is it's really a little bit like insurance. You know you need to buy it because in case something really bad happens, you need to fall back on it. But the reality is you have that challenge of where does my dollar go? And often there's somebody that has a shared responsibility of security to ask questions about what's being done, but without making that a dedicated focus for an organization, it's something that can be kind of left on the wayside.
Absolutely. And I mean, you're being very diplomatic, but I've talked to so many practices where, it's maybe a front office person or maybe it's a nurse, and they really don't want to do it. It's just that they are judged to have the best capacity or whatever the arrangements are inside the organization. But that's very different than someone whose entire job or a large part of their job is to ensure the security of cloud data services.
Agreed.
So this is, where the rubber meets the road. How do you avoid these problems, the potential minefields?
Yeah, well, it really starts with smart contracts. When you are working with a cloud services vendor, it's really important that you start to ask questions of those vendors to make sure that you have all of the liability and the risk and the availability and all of these items specifically covered contractually. You want to make sure that you understand how you can terminate a contract. One of the challenges that we've seen from many healthcare organizations is they've entered into an ironclad contract for 5 years with a large organization and found that the software didn't perform, the availability wasn't there, but there wasn't any way to terminate, and there was certainly nothing as a termination of convenience. There may have been a conversation with a sales rep that said, yep, here's what it looks like to terminate, but there was nothing that was done contractually. So it's so much a focus on assessing the quality of the vendors or solutions, which is something that we'll talk about in just a little bit. But it's incorporation of that business associate agreement. It's incorporation of conflict resolution, making sure everything is addressed contractually so you have a really great place to fall back to. And then it's really focusing on service level agreements. And I make reference here to the fact that there are 4 P's to watch out for. The first P is promises. The second is provisioning. The third is penalties. And the fourth is process. And I'll dive into each of those. So the promises. What are you promising in terms of uptime? What are you promising in terms of support response times, of maintenance windows? How am I making sure that there are stipulations to meet the urgent needs that you may have in healthcare that may be different from another organization? As it relates to provisioning, how do I know how my resources or how my pricing will grow? How do I know what I'm actually paying for? When we get to that discussion again of utility versus provisioned, what is provisioned? What's consumed as a utility service? And how are the costs of those going to look in a year or two from now? As we look at potential challenges with the promises that are made or the provisioning promises that are made, what are the penalties if a service provider doesn't honor their commitments? So most cloud providers will offer you a 99.9% availability of the cloud platform. What that equates to is about 43 minutes a month per downtime. When the availability drops below that, what do you do? Does a service provider offer financial credit? Do they provide some other mechanism of making your business right for that downtime? And what is meaningful for your business to consider in that space? And then the last thing to think about is the maturity of that service organization, and that's specifically their processes. Are they doing things like change management? Are they defining what their maintenance windows are? Are they talking about how they're managing to their SLAs and the things that they're doing to make sure that they can be available to you from a support standpoint? Are they aligned to industry best practices in the way that they are taking care of that cloud infrastructure and taking care of you as a healthcare organization?
Well, in talking about, these SLAs, everything gets so, this is where really the specifics are nailed down. And so it can be intimidating, or should there be, you talked about their obligations to maintain the cloud infrastructure. Should there be some understanding or agreement that they are going to upgrade hardware at some certain rate, or what's reasonable along those lines?
Yeah, what you really want to focus on is what's in scope and what's out of scope. In terms of what you have in scope and out of scope, that can vary pretty significantly from one cloud solution to another cloud solution. But the thing that's important to know is, does the value that you receive for the dollars you're paying, does that make sense? You may find a cloud solution that says, we're going to do everything for you. We are going to build the infrastructure, install the applications, we're going to do the patch management, the monitoring, the antivirus, the backups, the security, the everything, and here's the cost associated with it. Or you may find an offering that says, hey, we'll provide you the infrastructure, and it's on you to do that patch management and that monitoring and all of the software maintenance. It's really just about making sure that the scope is very clear for both sides, so you don't have ambiguity and there isn't any frustration or challenge, and you can use that to determine, does this price point for this solution really make sense?
That's great advice. That makes a lot of sense. And then that brings us naturally to this. How are you supposed to know whether you've got a good cloud solution or vendor?
There are lots of questions that you want to make sure that you ask during that pre-sales process. That pre-sales process is really your time to negotiate, because after you've signed the agreement, it's so much harder to do that. One of the organizations that does a really good job in this space of helping organizations, not just healthcare organizations, but any organization looking at a cloud solution, understand what they need to focus on, is the Cloud Security Alliance. They're a not-for-profit organization dedicated to defining and are raising awareness best practices for secure cloud environments. The Cloud Security Alliance is really a collection of individuals that come from private business, from public business, from governments, all coming together bringing that knowledge. And what they've done is they've provided guidance on the questions to ask when selecting a cloud vendor. And they give questions in the context of general questions, legal questions, audit questions, security questions, which include things like risk and vulnerability and business continuity, questions on environmentals or equipment, questions on disaster recovery. For organizations that are really serious about this, the Cloud Security Alliance actually has a certification that a client can obtain that they've gone through all of the training and they understand all the questions to ask. But when it comes down to it, I think customer references are some of the most important. What we've heard from healthcare organizations is, again, it's all about trust and it's about that network. What is your colleague at another healthcare practice doing? That's usually where a healthcare organization looks first, and it should be no different of finding customer references from that cloud vendor that you're looking at. When you get those customer references, it's doing a deep dive. Understand exactly what that cloud vendor does for that organization. Don't take it on face value that when you see a customer reference that you understand. And I'll give you a really great example here. When we work with software vendors will typically put logos on their webpage saying we work with these organizations. One of the vendors that we looked at lists the Department of Defense as the organization that they worked with. So we dove in there, and what we found out is that it was a subcontractor of the Department of Defense. And we found out inside that subcontractor, it was only really one or two people in that subcontractor for a specific project that they were doing. And it wasn't really representative of that vendor's solution, but it was something that, as we saw it, we said, hey, look at this. They're probably security oriented, working with government. They have to be doing these things. And then you pull the layers of the onion back and you realize what's actually happening. So understand exactly what that cloud vendor does for that client. Understand what works well. Understand what the pain points are. Understand the quality of the support, the account management. Make sure that you can do as much as possible to experience that cloud vendor before you actually sign a contract with that cloud vendor. And those customer references are really great ways to obtain that information.
Well, and that's a very funny anecdote as well, funny and chilling as well. Don't necessarily believe all the seals that you might see on somebody's About Us page. So
yes, absolutely.
I love this subject of the cloud, and we're going to have a little bit of time to take questions and talk about it some more. But for our last question, put on your prediction hat and tell us, what are we going to see in the next 6 to 12 months regarding healthcare and cloud?
Yeah, what we're really going to see is a continued expansion of cloud. We've seen studies from Microsoft, for example, surveying all across the world, where do they think cloud is going? And one of the trends that they're seeing is managed is the new normal. And when they say that, what they really mean is that it's not just enough to offer a basic cloud solution. It's about how to manage that cloud solution, again, focusing on having the healthcare organization do the things that are strategic to them as a business, and having that cloud or technology organization do the things that are strategic to them as a business. So they say that 62% of cloud and infrastructure spending is going to come from that managed relationship of having that curated cloud vendor. We're also expecting to see that hardware lifecycle post-meaningful use will accelerate cloud adoption. So a lot of the benefit of cloud, of that scalability, may not have existed in the past, so it was purchasing infrastructure to accommodate things like meaningful use reporting. And as that hardware is aging, more and more organizations are now looking to cloud, saying that now is the right time to consider it. They're looking and saying the changes to meaningful use with the introduction of MACRA, there's more of a need for analytics of how am I doing from a population health standpoint? What can I be doing to tie more data together to be making more informed decisions? But through all of this, we expect to see a growth of service providers. We expect to see that organizations like Microsoft, for example, with Azure, are leading with a partner-first strategy that says, sure, you can consume Azure directly from us, but the reality is there's going to be enough complexity there that you're going to want to work with a service provider that can help remove that complexity, that can help you with the migration services to get in, and then they can be the organization that's that one throat to choke, so to speak, of I asked this organization and they are my trusted cloud advisor. So we really expect to see more and more growth of that service provider, more and more growth of cloud solutions, and then service providers focusing on how these cloud solutions tie together to form a cohesive model for healthcare organizations.
So that's really interesting. So for people who may not know, Azure is Microsoft's, correct me if I'm not putting this right, but it's essentially their secure communication software. I mean, give a better gloss of it than that, if you would. What does Azure do
Yeah,
exactly?
absolutely. Yeah, so when we were first talking a little bit about cloud, one of the things that we didn't cover was public cloud, private cloud. So public cloud is really that focus on large-scale shared access across hundreds or thousands of subscribers. And the example with Microsoft Azure, for example, is let's say I want a virtual computer. Great, I can go up to Azure. They have the data centers and the hardware. The server that my virtual machine is sitting on could be shared with several hundred other servers. A different model there is private, where you're scaling the environment to a specific client. It may be provisioned from large-scale infrastructure, but it's dedicated to a client. So when we talk about something like Azure as an example, that's a public cloud that you can have these large-scale services that you consume, but it also gives you the model where you can say, I still want to carve out services that are specific to me. But there's enough complexity there that Microsoft is recognizing, let's work with service providers because they'll translate that
Right.
to the desired business outcomes.
Which is really interesting, and it goes to that point you're saying about how as providing a service, how do you integrate all of these different things? And it's clear that having, you know, to call them a cloud service provider is, I think, the term you're using. Someone other than Microsoft in that relationship is going to have to be involved just to bring everything together.
Exactly. Being able to bring those technology solutions together can actually be one of the more challenging things because there are so many solutions out there, and finding the puzzle pieces that are going to be the best fit to get those desired outcomes requires someone with experience in that space.
That is very true. Well, thank you so much, David. We have time for questions, and we're going to get to those. But before we get to the questions that we have from our audience, we'd like to thank Netgain for being our sponsor for this event. Netgain does work in the cloud space, and so that is why we were able to rely on their expertise. If you would like to learn more about Netgain hosting, go to www.netgainhosting.com, and we'll talk a little bit more about Netgain after we address some questions, but we thank them once again. So one of the questions we got from the audience was this issue of the silos, and we were sort of touching on this at the end. You had said on an earlier slide that you've got these silo issues where different technologies may not connect. And that was cited as a downside. How do people get past that problem? Is it through using, a service provider who can figure out those silo issues?
It really is. Having a service provider that can offer you the level of flexibility to address those legacy applications and talk about how they can come forward. So in the example that I mentioned, there was an organization that we worked with that had a RIS 6000. They were, again, an early adopter for healthcare, and as they were considering moving to cloud, they were trying to figure out, well, what do we do with this large legacy system? Do we put it in a co-location facility? Do we keep it on site? Certainly, we can't migrate that to cloud, and it's really, in that case, all about flexibility. So in this case, it was a discussion of how can we focus on having that private telecom between your organization and Netgain as a service provider. Right next to the rest of the data that's hosted in that cloud.
All right, here's another question on more of a security subject. Will having my data in the cloud be beneficial if our practice gets audited?
Really, when your practice gets audited, it's all about the controls that you have in place. It's about the risk assessment that you've done against your cloud vendor. So where it can be beneficial are things like physical security, for example. Where it can be beneficial are notions of centralization. If that data is located in the data center and it's not on site at your organization, those are all things that are really beneficial. But if you're not doing anything to ensure that you have that business associate agreement, or you're not doing anything to understand how that cloud organization is handling your data, then that doesn't really help you. So it's really just making sure that you as a business put together that clear understanding of the risk associated with that, and you document that risk.
That's great advice, because sometimes it seems like people, they're hoping that there's just a switch they can flip that will make them HIPAA compliant, and unfortunately that's never the case. You still have responsibilities you have to take care of. But like you said, cloud services can make a huge difference in terms of offering you tools to meet your HIPAA obligations.
Agreed. When you have a hosting provider, for example, that can bring more solutions to bear, like log management, for example, like file integrity, for example, like centralized vulnerability scanning, or these tools that are easier for a service provider to do that are harder for a smaller business, absolutely, those can be huge benefits of helping with that. But again, it's still understanding where the data is, how it's protected, and documenting that information. Either having that service provider document it for you as part of meaningful use attestation, or having that done as a formal risk assessment, again, also as part of meaningful use attestation.
Well, along the same line, we had a question about availability. You had talked about the need for it, in terms of reliability of the services and that sort of thing. But if an organization suffers some kind of disaster, should there be an expectation, or is this something that they should consider as an option to be able to, basically get their IT services back up, even if their facility is destroyed?
Yeah, cloud is a fantastic solution for that type of business challenge. Whether you have your entire infrastructure off premises and in the cloud, you're just talking about doing that failover between infrastructure environments in that cloud solution space, or you're talking about having your on-site infrastructure have that data be backed up to the cloud. So in the case that that environment is jeopardized for some reason, that you can take those resources and spin them up in the cloud and start accessing them. The cloud's ability to be elastic, the cloud's ability to be subscription-based, the cloud's availability really makes that a great solution for cloud to solve.
Yeah, we had a practice talk to us just recently. A building next to them suffered a gas explosion, no fault of theirs, and the building they were in was condemned, and their data was in it, and they were not allowed by the police to go into the building, and so they had, a serious problem to deal with. So that might have been avoided if they had gone with a cloud service.
One of the things that you can make sure to do is when you're working with a cloud service too is focus on redundancy in that path to get to that cloud service. So maybe having 2 internet connections, having potentially a private connection back to that cloud provider and a secondary connection as an internet connection that can use security technology like VPN to get access to that in case that first path fails. You do want to make sure that when you have a cloud solution that you're putting in those protective mechanisms, but you're also doing the business continuity side that's part of HIPAA and high tech.
Yes.
That focuses on what happens if I can't access this data. How does my clinical organization or my healthcare organization continue to function in this business? And that's important too, even when you're looking at a service provider, is to make sure that you're selecting a service provider that's that's well established, and you're not worrying about them going out of business and you losing access to that data.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And when it's not just as you said, of course it is required by HIPAA high tech, but for the business continuity, but for this practice, there's this other side of it that they were concerned about even surviving as a practice because they couldn't get access to that data. So, the government might be angry at them down the road, but at this point they were just trying to survive as a business and as a medical practice without having access to any of their records.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, David. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the good folks at Netgain do? Uh, they do work in the cloud arena, so tell us more about some of the services that they're able to provide.
Yeah, at Netgain, we really focus on coming into a healthcare organization, really talking with you and understanding your needs, and then focusing on creating that cloud solution that's going to best serve your needs. Typically what that solution looks like is taking that electronic health records application, moving that to our data center, and then presenting that back out with a remote technology like Citrix or Terminal Services. So we centralize that data. We keep it protected from the disasters that can happen on site. We do the backups, the patch management, the antivirus. We do the alerting and monitoring. We typically act as a staff augmentation solution and can be that first call for support. We can just as well partner with existing IT staff as well to do a second tier of support or escalations. But in all of these solutions, we're focusing on the centralization of data. We're focusing on making sure to do that proactive health and monitoring and backup to ensure that our clinical organizations are meeting their desired business outcomes, and they're leveraging technology as a strategic asset and not simply as an expense.
I love that. That's a great way of putting it. And that's really where so much is headed in health IT. It's where the government is encouraging people to go, but it's also where the whole, health IT industry is moving in that direction. To say that again, please, about the strategy versus an expense.
Yes, technology should be leveraged as a strategy and not simply seen as a cost center, because when you look at it as a cost center, you look at it as a necessary evil instead of looking at it for how it can transform your business, how it can help you do better patient engagement, better population health, how you can have really a better practice overall through the use of technology.
Well, I think, as I've said before, that this is the future of computing and healthcare is actually a little slow coming to some of it, but I really think that there's no limit to what the cloud is going to do for folks, and it's no surprise to me that more and more folks are moving into it. David, thank you so much for being with us. If folks have questions about Netgain, please go to netgainhosting.com But we've had many experts on from Netgain talking about different aspects of security and health IT. And David, again, it was a great presentation, so thank you.
Yes, thanks for having me.
So again, if you have questions about these, any of these concerns, you may want to talk to Netgain Hosting. Feel free to contact them. As we said before, we will send you a follow-up email with the slides from this session and a recording of the event. Thank you again to Netgain, and thank you to all of you for joining us for this learning lunch. If you'd like to register or look at our upcoming learning lunches, you can go to our homepage or just keep your eyes peeled for our next event. We love presenting this information to the public, and again, we thank our expert David for joining us today. Have a good day, everyone. We'll see you at the next learning lunch.